Good afternoon. Um, Welcome. I am Stacy Groders, the Interim Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, and I am so pleased to be able to welcome you to our virtual Excellence in Teaching Day event. We thought hard about whether to even hold ETD this year, considering the real struggles we're all facing in the current moment. But given our planned focus on the question of re-envisioning resilience and Professor McGee's invitation to cultivate the inner work of teaching and learning, it seemed important to find some way to gather and reflect together on these timely themes. Of course, this virtual gathering is a poor substitute for our typical opportunity to connect in person, and the webinar format in particular can feel isolating. But do know that as of this morning, we had 200 people registered. So you can imagine yourself as part of a robust, if distanced, community today. Now, speaking to that webinar format, you will likely see fewer controls in your Zoom window than you're used to. On the bottom left corner of your screen, you should see an audio settings button where you can adjust where your sound is coming from. In the middle is a raise hand and Q&A button. We'll use these more once we get to the question and answer period, but do please feel free to type questions into the Q&A at any time, and Professor McGee will respond as she is able. The CC button allows you to turn on closed captioning, which is being provided in real time today by a live transcriber. Finally, please note that as attendees, your personal video will be muted throughout the webinar and your microphones are muted for now. We are recording the webinar and it will be posted publicly on the CTE website. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Vincent Rougeau, the Dean of the Law School, who has kindly agreed to introduce Rhonda McGee today. One of the things that's drawn me to Professor McGee's work is how it weaves together seemingly disparate conversations: contemplative pedagogy, racial justice, and the law. And so I'm grateful for Dean Rougeau to make time for us to join us today and to help put Professor McGee's work into some context. So Dean Rougeau, we'll turn things over to you.
Rhonda V. McGee is Professor of Law at the University of San Francisco and is an internationally recognized thought and practice leader focused on integrating mindfulness into higher education, law, and social justice. A student of a wide variety of Buddhist and other wisdom teachers, including Joan Halifax, Norman Fisher, and John Kabat-Zinn, she trained as a mindfulness teacher through the Oasis Teacher Training Institute of the University of Massachusetts Center for Mindfulness. She teaches mindfulness-based interventions, awareness, and compassion practices from a range of traditions. In October 2019, she received the Garrison Institute's Insight plus Impact Award. Born in Kinston, North Carolina to working class parents, Rhonda was a successful first-generation college student. A student and practitioner of mindful leadership, she's a former president of the board of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society and a fellow of the Mind and Life Institute, where she recently completed a 2-year term on its steering council. She's a member of the Board of Advisors of the University of Massachusetts Center for Mindfulness and the chair of the Board of Directors for the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. Professor McGee is a 1989 graduate with distinction of the University of Virginia College of Arts and Sciences and a graduate of UVA's U.S. Army Reserved Officers Training Corps. She earned both a master's degree in sociology from UVA's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and a Juris Doctorate from the UVA School of Law in 1993. A professor of law for 21 years and tenured since 2004, she teaches courses dealing with civil actions for personal injury and insurance recovery, courses dealing with race and inequality, and a course she co-created called Contemplative Lawyering, which blends mindfulness-based stress reduction and other contemplative practices with lawyering skills. She's been teaching this course continuously at the University of San Francisco for the last 10 years. Rhonda recently published her first book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice: Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness, in September 2019, published by Tarcher Peregree, which is part of the Random House Group, Penguin Random House Group, excuse me. And it was named one of the top 10 books released for the year by the Greater Good Science Center and received similar recognition by Psychology Today and the editors of mindful.org. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Rhonda V. McGee.
Hello, everybody, and thank you. Thank you so very much for joining me and inviting me to join you, I should say, in this conversation, this virtual keynote. Again, I just really want to offer appreciations to the team of people at Boston College, without whom I certainly wouldn't be here. Sarah Castricum really has been a very strong friend in this work, and a person who invited me first, brought me to the attention of those who are standing in support of our effort today. And so I just want to thank the entire Boston College community for taking the time and by taking this time, underscoring your commitment to teaching and learning in ways that may continue our own development as teachers and practitioners of the craft of teaching, but really with a view, obviously, toward deepening our capacity to help make the most of the learning opportunities of the wide and diverse range of students that we are privileged to work with each year. And so I want to go ahead and share some slides with you. Let's see if we can, go ahead and share these slides that I've prepared to support us in this conversation. So we're going to be talking about really the inner work of teaching and learning for all. I'm using this title for now, Mindfulness and Revolutionary Equity, Teaching, Learning, and Practicing the Inner Work of Racial and Social Justice. But really it's about how is it that through our work on campus, whether we're serving in the role of classroom teachers, or whether we're serving in support staff positions, administrative positions, wherever we find ourselves in the campus community, this is a conversation about exploring the inner dimension of the work that we do to support teaching and learning for all. And it is about deepening our capacity to excite those with whom we work, colleagues and students, in a similar kind of journey, beginning from the inside and deepening our ability from a place of honoring our own personal experiences, our lived experiences, where we are on arcs of development, because we're all works in progress around these sorts of things. But from the place of deepening our capacity to really do our own work and explore what's most true and most known and knowable within ourselves as we work with others. From this place, we might, the basic hypothesis of this talk is, or the thesis of the talk is, it is from the place of deepening our capacity for our own inner work, inner development around issues of justice, issues of bias, issues of equity, that we can help create opportunities for growing and learning together in our classrooms and in our workspaces on campus more broadly. And so I want to just begin with a gratitude reflection, because I think grounding in gratitude here is just an example of one of the ways that, for me, contemplative engagement in the classroom and on campus often shows up. So I can say more about the research behind this, but just to make a quick note on that, research has shown quite a number of benefits from basic reflection on gratitude, including, in a way that might be surprising for some, studies that show that reflecting on gratitude may indeed significantly impact performance in the classroom. And so, if we begin with a little bit of gratitude here and now, it certainly, again, embeds this idea of really exploring the potential for a simple kind of gratitude practice to support us in our contemplative teaching and learning objectives. And here, for me, I just am naming some of the small subset, really, of the number of teachers, guides, and supporters who helped me advance along this path. And so I won't really speak to all of the names, but I will point out one whose name I know, while some of the names may be familiar to some of you, I know one name probably is familiar to almost no one, and that's Nanny Suggs. And I call her out as my own grandmother, actually. She is, I consider her to have been my first teacher. And she was a person who was born in 1906 in Kinston, North Carolina. Anybody who knows American history will know that for women of any background, that was a very different time than now. And because my grandmother was born into the heritage of those who had been formerly enslaved, her opportunities as a Black racialized woman in the South in the, for a lifetime that spanned virtually the 20th century were very limited. I mean, and so she did not have a lot of opportunities for the kinds of educational and other developmental opportunities that I have had. And yet, she was a person who began every day with a discipline of inner work. And so because I grew up witnessing or spent a significant amount of time as a child living with her during periods of difficulty in my own parents' home, frankly, I was able to see how she would get up every day before dawn and center herself in a sense of her own purpose, a sense of her own value, as a preparation for the work that she did in the world. And her work was a lot different from mine. She was at that time cleaning houses, so she was engaged in that kind of service work, which I have been somehow trained not to understand as essential and valuable, but now during this period of pandemic in particular, we're hopefully starting to reevaluate and maybe more rightly appreciate the value of all of the many people without whom we would be here, including people who are doing now the kind of work that my grandmother was doing then. And so with gratitude, and I pause and invite all of us to call to mind the various teachers, official formal teachers and those who've helped us in really kind of traditional, maybe academic and other developmental disciplines, but also informal teachers, people in our lineage, in our heritage, in our own families, who've shown us something about the value of commitment to our own inner work as support for what we might do, how we might offer our highest and best version of the skills and abilities that we have. So just to give a little bit of an overview, we're talking here about contemplative pedagogy and social justice. And by social justice here again, I mean looking at questions of equity on our campuses, right, in the various different settings that we find ourselves. So in our departments, right, the campus or university as a whole, obviously in the subunits that make up our institution, right down to the classrooms, committee spaces. The idea is this something called justice, something around equity. Might be a feature of all of these aspects of place-based work on campus. And thinking about the role of contemplation, the role of a contemplative approach to these questions of equity, and to these questions of social justice. And I'm using those terms in ways that I'll explore more in a bit. But essentially, those are terms that for me invite us to think well and deeply and continuously about the distribution of resources that are available and the ways that some of our cultural habits and patterns around identity groups, around whose voices matter and whose don't, may be impacting the distribution of these resources, including opportunities, including voice, including recognition, in ways that might not be obvious and in ways that we might want to disrupt if we're seeking to create places of work and learning and growing together that are more aligned with our deeper values and commitments. And so we'll be talking about contemplative pedagogy and the links between the efforts that we might make to deepen the capacity for all of us to learn and grow together in the direction of a better world. And I think these are so important. These things are so important at this time, because while sometimes we might be tempted to think that looking at questions of equity and the distribution of resources is, something we can do. It's nice for us to think about, but that maybe isn't so central for the work that we do in academia. I think that especially now, in the midst of this pandemic, the links between all of our work and these questions of the distribution of the kinds of resources that are necessary for us to thrive, the kinds of resources that are necessary for us to participate in the formation of ourselves and communities within which we can, actually make good on our commitments to teach in ways that support the formation of folks who can be for others, who can live and apply their skills and their knowledge, not only for themselves, but for the benefit of the world. So I'll say a few more things about contemplative pedagogy, the links between that and social justice, and the inner work that I think animates my own passion for this. And we'll then shift to an opportunity to reflect together on challenges, opportunities, and questions and answers that might be coming up for us as we really unpack the journey of this work. And so I just want to start by putting contemplative pedagogy in a Jesuit context. We have in common, you at Boston College, me at the University of San Francisco, that we are able to lean into the Jesuit tradition as a support for the work that we're doing on campus. And this is, of course, I'm violating the rules of PowerPoint by having all of these words on a slide. So bear with me, but this is a quote that was cited in our Jesuit periodical Conversations in Higher Education. And this was in an essay looking at the concept of cura personalis, and in which the author posited that we as teachers and administrators actually have this opportunity to deeply involve ourselves and in fact probably can't do our work really at the level that we'd like to if we're not exploring ways of meeting our students where they are, taking personal interests in the intellectual, affective, moral, and spiritual development of our students. We have in these capacities opportunities to listen to our students' cares and concerns, our colleagues' cares and concerns, frankly, if we're open to that as well. In other words, on these Jesuit campuses, we are actually, I think, privileged to have a deeper engagement with each other, our colleagues, and certainly with our students, if we are willing and capable of doing that. And so really thinking about how it is that we prepare ourselves to be in a position to support the development of the whole student, right? To teach and learn as this idea of cura personalis invites us to do. We're concerning ourselves with the entirety of the whole person. What does it take within ourselves to be able to explore more deeply our role in support of the development of the whole person? The personal growth, the growth in the direction of more robust and effective interpersonal relationships, we as teachers and administrators are in a position to live in a way that offers an example to our students. And that might invite or include us to share aspects of our own life experiences, ways that we are working to deepen our own commitments to self-care and self-development in a way that can continue throughout our lifetime. And so I guess one of the core theme then of this conversation for me and of this work centering on the inner work of being able to more richly support teaching and learning for everyone. We can look at this as being an invitation to explore what might get in the way for us of showing up in ways that could really create more of an inclusive community wherever we find ourselves on campus. And I offer that way of thinking about it with deep humility, because again, I'm right there with you. I think we're all, as I've mentioned, and I will mention, we're all works in progress on this kind of a journey. And I see this aspect of our work as teachers as really what animates and enlivens the work for me in the classroom every year, right? It's what keeps me from getting too much of a sense of, yes, I've done this before, semester after semester, and any temptation to phone it in. I'm awakened, always through this commitment to my own inner work, to the great potential I have, the great benefit and privilege that comes with these opportunities we have to meet on campuses and to be a part of institutions that are committed to development. That includes us. And so there is this gentle kind of a push, if you will, for us to kind of accept this mission, accept more richly this opportunity to be really involved with deepening our work for the work that we do in the world. But to do that in a way that cares for ourselves as part of that process. So self-care, certainly I think, is one of the aspects of what I think this inner work includes. But it's self-care that recognizes that we're always already in contexts, and how we are, how safe we feel in speaking our voice, which is so important to effectiveness in the 21st century world in which we live. For us to make the most of our opportunities to teach effectively, we ourselves have to feel that we are doing what we can to heal the things that ail us, to work on the things that might get in the way of us being able to appreciate each other from each other's different backgrounds, looking into the way in which we may carry biases, the biases of our culture that seep into all of us. And so there's a way in which I do think that the lens of care for self and others is really an important way of thinking about what this inner work is about. So it's through the lens of care for self and others, realizing the interrelational contexts in which we always are in, right? We're always in places where we're working together. How we show up has such profound implications for our well-being, but also the well-being and effectiveness of our students. And so I think of mindfulness as a support for this, as many of you know, if you've looked at my work at all, as one form of the contemplative pedagogical project. And so I'll define mindfulness here as a way of being more fully aware and alive to, right, the deep, rich potential of teaching and of working in various different support and administrative roles on campus. How can we really be awake to these unrepeatable moments that we have to listen to each other, to hear each other, to work together in collaboration around things that matter, And how can we, from this place of greater presence of aliveness, wakefulness, take more effective action to alleviate the suffering of ourselves and others? Number one, take more effective action to alleviate that kind of suffering. That's another way of referring to the role of compassion in our work, right? Compassion often being defined as not just feeling, right, empathic engagement with the suffering of others, but actually the will to take action to alleviate. And so some of the ways that you might think of compassionate action being related to this effort to create more effective spaces for teaching and learning is to recognize that our students and our colleagues and some of us, we're suffering in these workplaces and in classrooms when we are not feeling seen, appreciated, not feeling perhaps as if our perspective matters. And so mindfulness is a way of preparing ourselves for the work of taking those steps that might be called for to minimize the kind of suffering and discomfort that can come up in diverse and in these settings in which we're coming together from very different backgrounds and trying to collaborate and learn together. So, mindfulness. Then I often use a definition from one of my teachers, John Kabat-Zinn. We're talking really about, yes, being aware and awake and alive to these moments. A more precise definition from the disciplines of mindfulness and research communities of mindfulness is to, get us thinking about practices that support paying attention in a particular way. And in that particular way, we mean on purpose, right? So you're paying attention with intentionality. So you're intentionally directing our attention, placing our attention where we'd like. And that particular way embodies a certain kind of openness to what might be here. And so that's another way of thinking about what I meant in the previous slide by referencing being alive and awake to these opportunities for deepening connection, for alleviating suffering. Mindfulness as a set of practices and then a way of being in our relationships and in our work together that is characterized by this kind of quality of presence. Again, that willingness to pay attention with a certain kind of openness, willingness to really turn toward what is here to be seen, even if what might be arising might be somewhat difficult. So we can talk more about mindfulness as a particular sort of discipline or pathway into or support for contemplative pedagogy, by which I mean to point to that very broad range of different ways we might deepen our students' ability to access a kind of first-person subjective, right, sense of knowing and quality of understanding that when coupled with the third-person ways of knowing and understanding through research, right, through the scientific methods, through all the different disciplines that we bring to bear in our work on campuses, right? Contemplative pedagogy is naming explicitly that first-person ways of knowing, whether through mindfulness or other practices, reflection, introspection, and more, are really important and may be really important to deepening our ability to work with the third-person ways of knowing, the research, the objective analyses that may also be really critical to our students, deepening capacities within their disciplines and performance in the world. But contemplative pedagogy also centers on the second person aspect, the relevance of our interrelatedness in these classrooms. And it's these interpersonal aspects that I think we often turn to when we're thinking about how it is that our inner work can support us in creating more effective teaching and learning spaces for our students. Because when we come together, we see all kinds of ways that we are energized by our being together, but also sometimes our well-being may be negatively affected by conflict, by predictable ways that bias may show up. So there are many different ways that contemplative approaches to this work can support us and can support the teaching and learning objectives that we have. I have this slide that really points us towards some of the research that supports our thinking about this. The general wellness and performance and the work that we might do in the direction of really looking at the legacies of our history of oppression and how that can show up right in our classroom. So mindfulness practices have been shown to really help support, again, sustain ability to maintain focus over periods of extreme stress or difficulty. Certainly, the period that we're in writ large during the pandemic is a period of extreme stress. So if for no other reason than to help all of us get through this period a little bit more effectively, we might be thinking about exploring mindfulness. But research has also begun to show that mindfulness can help reduce bias, the kinds of bias that is measurable on things like the implicit associations test that many of you may be familiar with, and we can talk a little bit more about. But this is a test, an online vehicle that gives us a bit of a measure of the way in which biases may be showing up in our own performance on this sort of association focused online measure. And so the implicit associations test, the IAT, is a test. Again, I know many of you on the call are familiar with that, but if you're not, please do make a note. It's something that you can explore. You can devote just 10 minutes to just checking out what the IAT might reveal in terms of different ways that habits and patterns that we have in our minds associating certain identity categories with certain characteristics and descriptors, how that may give us a window into subconscious ways or less conscious associations that might reflect some bias and might in some ways predict some kinds of often unconscious discriminatory tendencies or behavioral patterns that we might be carrying, that we may have inherited. And yes, research is starting to show that mindfulness can help disrupt these often unconscious or less than perfectly conscious patterns of association and bias that are within us. Research is also helping us to see that mindfulness can support not just minimizing bias in us, the biases that we may carry as teachers, as administrators, that might impact, for example, whose emails we open and read and pay attention to more quickly than others, which voices we listen to, which hands we select in a classroom, what kinds of materials we think are really important and from what sources. So if we want to start to really disrupt some of those patterns, mindfulness can support us with that. Research is helping us to see that. But there's another way in which mindfulness supports well-being and performance of those on the other side of all of this, those who might often find themselves or may have some history of having been targeted via stereotypes, these cognitive, what the social psychologists identify as these cognitive schemas or ways we have of, again, categorizing individuals in the world and associating those categories and hence individuals that are linked to them with certain characteristics. So these stereotypes and the fact that the human brain stereotypes, again, research has shown that this is a very common aspect of, how it is that we move through the world. But these common social psychological dynamics can get in the way, again, of what we might be trying to do to create classroom spaces and other opportunities for all of us to learn more effectively. So mindfulness can really help us in many ways, again, not just in disrupting bias, but also in minimizing the effects of stereotypes on us. So there's research that shows that stereotype threat, the threatened decrement or decreased level of performance that can happen when someone believes that their performance might confirm a negative stereotype, right? This idea of stereotype threat, again, if this is a new idea you haven't looked into very much, please make a note. There's a whole body of research confirming the reality that stereotypes in the air can, or in our midst, in our classroom spaces, on our campuses, that might be raised in a particular conversation, may impact performance and lead to a performance gap that has been measurable across a range of different identity types of categories. So this idea that stereotypes impact performance is something that social psychology has confirmed for us. But what we're just starting to see is that for those of us who have some mindfulness practice underneath our belt, we have a tool that can help disrupt the possible impact of stereotype on our performance. It gives us an ability and a set of practices for grounding in the capacities that we know we have, and being able, from that place of a grounded reconsideration of what it is that we came there to do, refocusing on our attention, gathering of our strength, and sort of quelling the sort of psychological noise, if you will, that stereotypes might otherwise create that could get in the way of performance. And so those are just a couple. I'm just pointing to research grounded sort of observations that we might make if we're thinking about how mindfulness might support us directly in helping create more effective spaces for teaching and learning. But for us to engage in the work of looking at how our classrooms are faring, we ourselves might need support for this inner work. As the Dean mentioned, I wrote a book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness, which is all about, and some of you may have had a chance to take a look at that book in preparation or as part of this effort to join this, this conversation today. But my effort there was to put in one place a set of practices and supportive reflections around how our own particular lived experience, our own identity-based experiences in the world are part of the self that we carry into our classrooms and our other, our workplace settings. And, the effort in my work in that book in particular is to support us in really recommitting to the inner work of reclaiming a more, a kind of a way of being in the world that recognizes how social identity-based harm and injury and stereotype and all these things that are not just features of our deep history, but that are coming at us all the time. We live in a world where through media and through really, frankly, all levels of our culture, stereotype is still with us. And so we are always being, as we live and breathe in the broader social cultural world, impacted by these narratives about who matters and who doesn't. So part of this work then is about reclaiming our own self and embodying a commitment to creating space and time for the work of really healing from oppression in our time. And so there is all kinds of, again, research that supports our understanding of the relationship between these practices of mindfulness and deepening resilience. Mindfulness can help us generally rebound from stressful incidents. And again, I don't have to tell any of you on this in this seminar what kinds of, about, I don't have to name that there are stressful incidents happening around us all the time. They happen in our classrooms, as we know as well. And again, research has shown that as compared to folks who are not trained in mindfulness, mindfulness can, again, be a kind of a deep support for helping us down-regulate in times of stress and access the neurobiological capacities we have within ourselves always for, for healing, for sort of managing anxiety and really deepening our capacity for right relationship with the stressful events of our days and our lives. I've already mentioned the research on how mindfulness can help reduce implicit bias. There's a citation to it there, as well as here, again, the research, a citation to the research that indicates that mindfulness helps decrease the derogatory impact of stereotyping and stereotypes for us. So again, we often think of mindfulness as maybe sitting in silence, have this beautiful picture of the kind of way in which we often think of mindfulness as bringing us a spotlight, almost a break from these difficult issues of social engagement and inequality and injustice, right? And I know I have been in enough conversations around these matters, and my own experience as a teacher and a facilitator of mindfulness practice has engaged me enough that I know that people sometimes say, wait a minute, I thought we go to mindfulness to avoid dealing with these issues or to have a break from all those kinds of stressors. So I guess I want to some extent, then burst a little bit of that kind of a bubble. Because on the one hand, while yes, certainly mindfulness can, and in my experience, certainly is a support for deepening a sense of calm, a sense of clarity, a sense of capacity to meet the challenges of our lives, that can feel like a kind of a balm, a kind of an eye in the storm. These practices were never, at the same time, they were never meant to kind of deepen our fragility, if you will, right? By kind of making us feel only safe in these places of calm. In fact, the idea, I think, is to sort of deepen our capacity for a resilient kind of moving in flow in response to the triggering stimuli of our lives, and to be really more capable of engaging with others from this place of mindfulness. So mindfulness has always then been about interrelational mindfulness, not just about personal, individual mindfulness. So I've already been talking a little bit about, again, this notion of socially engaged mindfulness, about how these practices of paying attention on purpose with a certain kind of openness and a willingness to turn toward what is here to be known on purpose, how it really can support us in how we are with our own suffering, our own wounds, and the way in which we carry and are called, carry those wounds and are called over the course of our lifetimes to maybe do our own healing work as we help support more effective work with others. This work is very much about, again, attending to the disruptions in our social world, including, again, the places and spaces where we gather for teaching and learning and for collaborative working together for the benefit of all of those who come together in our universities and college communities. So it's a socially engaged mindfulness practice that we're talking about. A practice that, yes, has these elements of personal sitting or otherwise engaging in the practices on our own, but is always already about how it is then that we engage with each other. So mindful speaking and listening in the direction of, again, responding to evidence that we may see of inequity or uneven distribution of resources around us that might be leading in ways that are not intended, right? Unconscious or unintended consequences of the way in which we move through the world in these social bodies with these trainings that we've inherited through the cultures that we've been trained in. Socially engaged mindfulness is about deepening our capacity for stamina and steadfastness when we're confronted with evidence of inequity or injustice in our lives, when we're confronted with evidence of unfairness. And it's about bringing a compassionate and kind commitment to staying in these hard conversations about inequity, and then to taking action to alleviate inequity in ways that can uplift all of us. And so I certainly have my own story of bringing these practices into the workplace. You heard a little bit about the class that I've created with others around mindful contemplative lawyering. And I will say that I've come to understand that while for me this was about finding a way of integrating my own commitment to my own self-care and inner work for my own healing, right? As you all have heard, I grew up in North Carolina. I was born actually in 1967. I think it's important often to name the arc of time we've been on the planet that gives us and places where we've lived that gives us all permission to speak more explicitly about the path that we've walked into these conversations in workplaces. And so for me, being born and raised in 1967 in the latter part of the 20th century, in a part of the country where segregation was then, and actually frankly still is, deeply embedded in the social environment as a legacy of a deep historical set of commitments to a racial hierarchy on which, and a gender hierarchy, frankly, and the intersections of those are very real, have been real in my life as a Black woman. People like me in that particular place were not expected to be able to do the kinds of things that I'm doing now, to be able to teach in an academic setting and lead conversations about it. And indeed, when I went to law school, graduated, became a law professor, I was presented with some challenges that were tied to the way in which stereotypes were showing up in the work. For example, showing up in courtrooms and having, there be visible surprise that I was there standing up on behalf of insurance industry clients, as opposed to being there as a defendant myself, or if anything, maybe representing a criminal defendant, but not, one of the largest insurers in the world. That's just giving you just a bit of a window into how my own lived experience featured into how it is that I came to understand, first of all, the value of these inner work practices for my own self, to help me with bearing up, continuing to show up, continuing to bring my highest and best I might. But the reason why I want to say this about how I started bringing this into my work in legal academia. I started to feel that as much as I was benefiting from these practices myself, my students might benefit as well. And I really felt strongly that if I couldn't bring them in some way, explicitly, with the support of my institution, everybody was missing out. And so I started to really explore ways of developing a course that, as was mentioned, ended up in this class called Contemplative Lawyering, where we bring a set of learning objectives around deepening the particular skills of lawyering through mindfulness-related practices and a supportive community of mindful practitioners in those classrooms, going back and forth between mindfulness and awareness practices and the particular skills that lawyers need to develop, like listening and speaking more effectively, as just one example. And so I started doing that and working on that in a particular class called Mindful Lawyering, but I was also working on that in my classes dealing with race and racism. And I was learning and seeing how it was that those my students were blossoming. They were learning to connect more effectively. They were learning to value their own experiences and their own voices, and to help create these mosaics through which, and interrelated conversations in which they could see how their own lived experiences were in some long, broad, deep conversation with the lived experiences of others whose backgrounds were very different around the tables that we would meet. And so this is just one, I'm just touching into one example of how I have been bringing mindfulness practices into classes specifically cultivated for lawyering skills on the one hand, but also classes that deal with other substantive issues, race and the law on the one hand, my personal injury, my tort law class is another place where maybe not featured to the same extent, but certainly to support students in recognizing the opportunity for deepening interpersonal awareness, some emotional intelligence, the capacity to listen to the stories of physical suffering that they will need to listen to and to be able to respond more, to be able to have some empathic relationship with if they're going to be able to be effective personal injury or tort lawyers, or those who can understand what's at stake in those cases more effectively. So for me, this has been a call first grounded in my own suffering, frankly. How do I work and heal my own suffering? And from that place, I thought, you know, if I can't bring this to my students, we're all missing out. And I was actually at a point of thinking maybe I should leave law and legal academia and go into a monastery or become a mindfulness teacher only. And I found, though, a guide, a supporter, a counselor, a therapist, frankly, who said to me, listen, you could always leave your job as a professor, but why don't you see if you can bring more of this in? And lo and behold, I found a supportive dean. I found supportive colleagues. I found a network of folks at the University of San Francisco, outside of the university, in broader legal academia, in law, and now this international community of folks who have again and again affirmed the value of a contemplative approach to teaching and learning on these various levels that I've talked about. So yes, this, I now see a photo that actually is one of the first, it's a little dated, right? You're seeing two versions of these classes in which I've been teaching about race and law. The one on your left now is the one that was my first class in which I explicitly started offering mindfulness way back in like 2004. And I really was able to see how it really supported my students. And on the right, you see an example of how we're taking our students now outside of the physical classroom into retreat settings. That's my race law class as well, going for a day long together so we can actually work to deepen our relationships and our understanding of the material and our, and to deepen mindfulness practice together through a kind of a day-long retreat. So yeah, we're exploring then new places for doing the work, new ways of doing the work, and really creating a new ways of thinking about what it means to bring a contemplative approach to teaching and learning in ways that can, revivify our work in academia, in the classrooms, in our disciplines for everybody, bringing the whole student, the whole self, including the difficult aspects of our context and our experiences right in with a lot of compassion and a lot of, I'm just going to use the phrase, fierce love, frankly, for what I think is at the heart of all of this for me. And by love here, I just mean that kind of, it's, to paraphrase Martin Luther King or Cornel West, it's it's another way of thinking about justice is to see it as what love looks like in public. It is to see us acting from the place of our care and concern, and to have that animate the efforts that we take to try to make, our work accessible. And so it begins with ourselves. It recognizes the interrelationship between personal, interpersonal, and collective, right? And it deepens, again, this into an ethic, a call, if you will, for really bringing this more compassionate approach to the work that we do in a way that can really help all of us heal in our own ways. So my own work obviously has been about transforming legal education and justice, but the work obviously of justice can show up anywhere. The work of transforming our workplaces and our classrooms in the direction of restorative, healing, right relationship can show up anywhere. And I'm going to begin to close by just sort of noting that how we work to heal, obviously, is ongoing work, because again, as I mentioned before, we're always, we don't reach a point in this society, in this culture, where we're kind of sealed off from ongoing wounds and harms, the narratives that would, raise the value of certain identities and groups over others, whether it's immigrants versus, the real Americans, or other ways in which we hear the recapitulations or the reifications of these notions of hierarchies of value. And so I had this picture of me. This is one of the few pictures I have of myself as a little girl. Those of you who are also familiar with growing up without a lot of material resources know what it's like to have grown up in the 20th century before our cell phones were ubiquitous, where, if you didn't have a lot of resources, you may not have had a lot of photos. So this is one of the only photos I have of me as a little girl, but I put this here to sort of normalize this idea. We're all carrying, all of those experiences that we've had. And some of them are forming and shaping the ways that we're meeting each other in ways that are not obvious. And we are, in our roles, engaging in creating of structures, policies, programs, classes, courses, curriculum that can embed inequity, that can lead to distress and trauma sometimes, or the experience of stereotyping, or the experience of not being well met in our institutional spaces and workplaces and classrooms. It can lead to the threat of stereotype that can impact the performance of faculty, of students, of administrators, of all of us. And so, mindfulness for me is one way in which this inner work happens is that it can help us pause, begin to notice the ways in which, when we are invited to look at this aspect of our experience, we might be feeling reactive. We might be noticing thoughts come up to discount, or noticing emotions. And the invitation is to take a conscious breath, breathing in and noticing, observing what is here to be felt, observing sensations in the body that might indicate that we're having some reaction to what we're hearing. So there's a very portable practice called STOP, S-T-O-P, which I'm engaging in with you right now, where we pause, we stop, you take a conscious breath. And we observe as we do so, we observe, what are we noticing in the body? In the way of maybe some reactivity, some way in which we're feeling in response to what we're hearing or what we're invited to turn toward. So S, stop. T, take a breath. O, observe what's coming up in terms of emotions, sensations, and thoughts. And from this more conscious place, oh, I'm feeling a little bit threatened by this. Oh, I'm feeling a little bit angered by this. I'm just noticing anger. I am not that anger. Maybe there's a gap between my broader self and this reactivity. How might I choose to respond and proceed? P, S-T-O-P. We might proceed with greater presence, greater awareness of a choice about how to engage with these materials. I am going to move through, again, there's lots of slides here that will make available to you all to deepen some of what we're talking about here. But the work that I do is really about helping us see mindfulness as a practice, a very dynamic practice that can help us recognize, accept, and investigate in the present moment, another acronym, RAIN, for how it is that mindfulness can help us recognize that what we're dealing with in terms of reactivity, stereotype, whatever it might be, accept, investigate how to respond to that more effectively, recalling our values, how we'd like to be in relationship to these aspects of our life, remembering that we're working together in contexts which create opportunities for us to have some power and influence relative to others, and a call for right relationship with our power in these contexts. Mindfulness helps us reopen our minds and give us an opportunity to respond rather than react, and then return into engagement from this place of greater resourcefulness. And the dynamism in all of this, I think, implies the resiliency that mindfulness can help create in us in this. So I'm going to stop the screen share now, because obviously I could keep going and we need to pause. I want us to shift as we might in the direction of creating an opportunity for questions and any reflections that might be coming up. But the basic idea, of course, of this work is just to really involve us in a commitment to thinking about how our own power, how we have power in our context to make a difference, to create spaces where we can begin to do our own work of healing and where we can support each other. And not just healing, but really building more robust spaces for teaching and learning that include opportunities for thriving for all of us. So with that, I would like to invite you back in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, for inviting us into such a thoughtful reflection on our practice as educators and our relationships with our students and each other. I wish I had some pre-recorded applause or something that we could play and hear everyone clapping from home. So we're now going to move into our question and answer period. For those who are attending, if you have a question, you can either type it into the Q&A using that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and then I'll read that aloud. Or you can press the raise hand button if you prefer to ask that question yourself, and then we can ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask that question. And if for some reason we're unable to get to your question, we do hope you'll consider sharing it on Twitter, where we've got a discussion going using the hashtag BCTeach20. All right, so let's see. I think we can, well, that's all right. Let me see where we'll go. So why don't we start with a question that came in from Paula Matthew. So Paula, thank you for your question. She writes, given the uncertainty of what our fall semester might look like, Rhonda, can you talk briefly about how you help invite students into contemplative practices when you are physically distant and potentially online? How do we connect as a community when we are far apart?
Such a great question. You know, and I think we're all exploring how to do that more effectively. We're all in this moment having this chance to really learn about doing this more effectively. And so I think one of the ways is really to really recognize that we can bring mindfulness practice in every way that we have for bringing it in while we're together. We can do it online. I actually have here, for example, a bell that I don't always use. Again, you all know that you don't necessarily need any special equipment to bring awareness practices alive, but a bell can help. And so I often, you know, when I'm offering a session, a teaching and learning session, a class session, a webinar, I'll often have a bell near me. And as I do right now, right? So just, I'll strike the bell and you can just see how just as we sit here, if I invite a pausing together with the support of this bell, how we might be able to experience it just for ourselves, just sitting here. So just, if you allow the sound of this bell to support, taking a good conscious breath in and grounding, feeling the ground beneath us and supporting us as we sit. So just noticing this bell as an object of awareness that can support us in pausing, attending to the sound of the bell to support us is just in turning our attention to the sensations of sitting and breathing for a second. Really allowing us to gather our thoughts and focus our attentions in those few moments that we might invite in. You know, gathering, and I often do this gesture as well, a movement kind of practice of gathering, and I'm really allowing my hands to drop at their sides. You can't see them rising up above, over the head, and then this gesture of bringing the attention right here, front and center. This is a kind of movement practice that we can do from a seated position. We can do it standing. But these are different ways that we could just invite a conscious invitation to pause, to center ourselves, to engage that stop practice that I mentioned. Stop, take a breath, observe what's happening, proceed from that place of presence. To invite that acronym of RAIN, recognize what's happening in a conversation where we might be getting a little bit triggered, accept that that's happening here, pausing and allowing space for the naming of something that's coming up. RAI, investigate what thoughts, emotions, sensations, what's happening between us. And really calling forth our intentions for how we want to relate more effectively and intentionally together. And doing all of that without attachment to outcome as best we can. These are some of the ways that we can just practice bringing the practices in. And it is about, I think, practicing and exploring, being willing to innovate and to improvise a little bit. But certainly, every way that you can think of bringing mindfulness in when you're in person, just about every way, we can adapt that to bringing it in when we are together online. And we've been doing that. Everything from, I've been working with folks to drop in moments of awareness, just as I just did here, on the one hand, to, you know, half days of retreat sessions, 3-4 hour sessions, where we're spending a lot more time pausing. We're doing breakout sessions where we're inviting mindful speaking and listening to each other with some guided prompts and some support for that. So there are just very, tons of ways to do it. And it really is limited only by our imagination. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we come together in spaces like this is to be able to create more of a culture of experimentation and sharing together, right? So hopefully you'll continue this conversation, obviously, together amongst yourselves in your teaching and learning groups and collaborative spaces for practicing together. I know that you all are a lively community of practitioners in the art of teaching and learning, and this contemplative project then invites this kind of experimentation and sharing what you're learning amongst each other. And so I just would encourage you to practice in some of those ways.
Thank you, Rhonda. Next question came in from someone asking if you could say a little more about what this looks like in the classroom, and particularly for a classroom that's not explicitly centered on mindfulness, where that's not the subject matter, but would still maybe be part of a pedagogical practice.
Great, thank you so much. So again, a very light way to introduce this into a classroom, whether in person or now the online version, might be to simply invite a practice of having a few minutes to arrive, right? Whereby you normalize pausing at the very beginning. So rather than launching right into the program, the agenda, the outline for the day, where you picking up where you left off, as we can often do, maybe to some, with some great effect in certain times and ways. But we could also invite a kind of practice of honoring the transitions from wherever we were to where we're going to go together as a classroom by pausing at the beginning. And so that is one way, that is a very simple way that I bring mindfulness into a range of different classroom settings. Again, putting aside the contemplative lawyering class example, which is obviously more focused on these practices, and even putting aside the race and the law classes where I've highlighted these practices more, for example, than in my torts class. In my torts class, we begin with these, you can call it, moments of gathering, transitioning, centering, gathering, refocusing. You can use whatever language sounds, like it would resonate with the audience that you have. And that is to sort of think about the languaging of this is simply a way of skillfully adapting these practices for the contexts that you're in. And so, yes, you can, that's one example, finding a way to create pauses that invite intentional presencing and grounding, focusing, stabilizing the mind. And so you can start with pauses at the beginning. There could be pauses as you transition from one aspect of the teaching and learning experience to another. I also have incorporated, again, mindful communication practices across the curriculum. So inviting students to, as they are listening, right, to really bring deeper attention to the practice of listening, which of course has such benefit no matter what material we're studying. When we're trying to engage with each other, deepening our capacity to listen well, which includes listening to ourselves, by the way, right? To notice when we're kind of feeling that we have to speak for this or that reason, noticing the inner reactivity and the inner voice, and trying to develop more of a capacity to discern, right? What is really called for and what is the contribution we want to make. So there are ways in which then mindful communication can be brought, I think, effectively into really just about any discipline. Another, just one last, I'll just offer as an example, beholding or bearing witness is a kind of practice that you could bring into any classroom. And it could be adapted to whatever sort of discipline, or we might explore it. By the way, there's a book that you all may be familiar with called Contemplative Practices in Higher Education by Mirabai Bush and Daniel Barbazat. And these are some of my former colleagues from my work with the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And in that book, it includes a lot of different examples of different types of practices that we might bring into our classrooms. And again, now the challenge is to adapt them to a virtual engagement. But the third type of practice I was going to mention, and that is, also one of the many different practices that you'll see in that particular book, and as well as in some of my writings as well, this practice of bearing witness or beholding. And that is a pointing toward the practice of pausing to pay attention to a visual, an audio, a sound recording of something. It could be a film, it could be a photograph, it could be a chart. But pausing to allow spacious contemplation of what there is to see. This, obviously, you can imagine this working in art classes, but not only for a class like art, right? Really giving students a sense of the consequences of a physical injury in a class like mine, in my personal injury class, my torts class. When we come to the section on damages, right, where the curriculum, you know, the objective, the learning objective, is to help my students understand a little bit more about the consequences of personal injury and the categories of recovery that an attorney can seek. Well, helping my students understand those consequences, obviously they're going to read case opinions in the traditional way that help see how argues debate, or how lawyers argue and debate in advocacy around these categories of damages for personal injury resulting from an accident or maybe an intentional harm. But so they're obviously they can read case opinions, but they also may know something about having been injured themselves or having witnessed injury. And we might also deepen our students' understanding by showing them the kind of video that sometimes shows up in a trial, a day in the life video of a person who's been injured, showing the consequences in terms of physical therapy, of difficulty moving, etc. Pausing and supporting students and really taking in what they see and noticing and describing what they are observing outwardly and also inwardly, some of the ways that they are reacting to this, and allowing some spaciousness around that. These are just some of the ways that we can experiment with bringing these into the classroom. And the last thing I want to say about that question is, for me, everything is about a contemplative inquiry. So the invitation is to inquire from our own practice place, from my place of practicing and deepening my own facility with different awareness practices. What then seems to be really naturally, organically arising as something that would serve the teaching and learning objectives of this particular course? And again, that's going to look different for each of us. So I would suggest finally just to see that as a contemplative inquiry to take into the work going forward.
Great, thank you. So we've got someone from the law school who wanted to ask a question. Philippa, I am going to unmute you. So if you want to unmute yourself, then you should be able to ask your question.
Hi, Rhonda. I've just been such a fan of yours in your reading, your writings, and the whole thing. And I just wanted to say that I think it's so wonderful that you really started as a pioneer in all of this with dealing with lawyers, because although we all need contemplative practices today, I really feel that lawyers as a group need the mindfulness so much more than so many others. And I just really wanted to thank you more than ask you anything. And so just it's wonderful to finally meet you online.
Thank you so very, very much for the work that you're doing in on campus, in the law school, and for being here in this conversation and amplifying, again, the work, the inner work that those of us who are called to meet people in moments of conflict, which is one way to think of what lawyering entails, right? We're the people. When some folks are in great distress or experiencing some of the worst, most painful incidents of our lives, they call on folks like us on the one hand, but also when they're excited and trying to create something new, right? The transactional lawyer opportunities. Lawyers get called in so many different, very robust and lively landscapes, let's just say. But there often is a lot of pain. And I don't want to, and there's nothing Pollyanna-ish about how I see this work, and nor is there about the work that lawyers do. A lot of the work that we do is really, really, really hard. And so a big part of my work has been about helping normalize a supportive practice environment for lawyers to help create sustainability in the work. I'm thinking right now of one of the students that I had in one of my early contemplative lawyering classes, who was training to be a death penalty lawyer. And I had known him from the time he was a student in one of my classes in the first year. And here he was in his third year. And I could visibly see him having changed, not in the direction of his highest and best, I will say. Something was really deeply troubling him. And I could see that in that contemplative lawyering class. And the nature of the class was such that it gave me permission to actually support him in inquiring into what was obviously troubling him. And through that process, he was able to name how he was being, frankly, carrying some secondary trauma, tertiary trauma, from having been involved in a death penalty clinic. And there's so many people, our students in family law clinics and all kinds of different, difficult work in the world are carrying that with them. And so before they even leave law school, sometimes are feeling the consequences of the challenges of this work. So yes, mindfulness as a well-being support for lawyers, absolutely. But everything that we do for ourselves in this regard has these benefits of helping us be more capable of supporting all those that we are privileged to work with. Students, colleagues, members of communities, the nation as a whole that depends in so many ways, seen and unseen, on a functioning legal system and as part of the whole democratic system. So thank you so much for what you're doing for the plan, for your comment. I appreciate it very much.
All right. Rhonda, now we've got a question from Katie Bilroy, and it's kind of an invitation to think about how our setting at BC isn't just a Jesuit one, but also a pluralist one. And what Katie asks is whether there are any non-Jesuit or non-Christian resources that you draw on in your practices and your courses. Are there traditions that you exposed your students to in addition to Jesuit spirituality?
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much for asking and naming that. Absolutely. And in fact, we too I hold my work in just the way that you do as well. I kind of want to be able to recognize that we are in these Jesuit institutions and can point to the values underlying that educational frame as part of what we do. But certainly, this is not meant to suggest that the way I approach the work is, I wouldn't even say it's dominantly through a Jesuit lens. From my perspective, mindfulness and contemplative practice is a fully humanistic and it opens up ways of exploring first-person ways of knowing from all varieties of traditions, practice, backgrounds, and heritages. So thank you for naming that. But I draw on a broad range that includes everything from indigenous wisdom and practice traditions to purely secular, if you will, holding that term lightly, translations or approximations of how it is that we can create opportunities to inquire deeply within, to reflect, to engage with compassion, to engage with all of those dynamics that may or may not be amplified through or refracted through the lens of Jesuit values. So yeah, I thank you for asking for that kind of broadening of the conversation, because absolutely, while I just want to name and respect the fact that Jesuit values kind of are there for us to turn toward and integrate as we might, I don't believe that what we're doing, even in a Jesuit institution, in any way requires or demands or calls upon us to offer these practices through that frame. So if there's any way in which someone bristled a little bit about that, which happens, I know. In fact, in my contemplative lawyering class at the University of San Francisco, I've had students really bristle at any reference to the Jesuit identity, or even, because to Catholicism, because again, it's a, it's an institutional, professional, educational space with a commitment to ecumenical or secular education for absolutely everyone. So thank you for that.
Rhonda, one last question. A couple years ago, we actually had Kathy Davidson as our keynote speaker, coming to speak to us about kind of her vision for the future of higher education. And one question she asked of us in the audience was to imagine like 1 or 2 changes we'd make to our institutions in order to move the academy into the future we aspired towards. And so I wanted to ask that question of you. So if you were queen for the day, if you could rule the world and could make 1 or 2 changes to higher education and how it functions, what changes would you like to see?
Wow, that's such a good question, and it's such a hard, juicy, hard to talk about 1 or 2. But I would say that I am inquiring as best I can into what this moment of this pandemic is teaching us about how we might answer questions like this. In other words, the moment that we're in, having revealed, laid bare, the radical interdependence of all of our lives with each other, of our cultures with each other, of, Wuhan, China on the one hand with San Francisco, California, or, Boston. So we are waking up to our radical interdependence. We are waking up to the challenges that come with that, the fears, the temptation to kind of wall off and reject the vulnerability that comes from recognizing interdependence. And I would say that if I could wave a wand, it would be in the direction of heightening our ability as institutions of higher learning to prepare our students and ourselves for a world that is committed to maximizing the potential of radical interconnectedness. And so I think deepening the sort of inquiry and the critiques around how it is that higher education continues to run patterns of maybe bias in the direction of elitism, if you will, or sort of not recognizing how we need all aspects. We need a rich, radical holism if we're going to really prepare people to engage in ways that maximize sustainability and growth for the whole planet. I guess there's something about, I think, the core way in which we do higher ed that I think often centers a little bit too much on hyper-individualism. Does not, as much as I think we need to for the 21st century, underscore radical interdependence. And I think if we don't find ways to measure our greatness by the measure of our capacity to support interdependent thriving in a planet, right, with limited resources, to bring the climate conversation into this, then I think we're really, we're going to be on shortened time. The world is going to look for institutions that can do this better. And so we, I think, might benefit by preparing ourselves as institutions for that world of radical interdependence, interconnectedness, and of being able to meet the challenges that come up with that, including the emotional challenges. And this is why I think emotional and social intelligence and all of the ways that we've been talking about practices to support that can really, really help us going forward. But it's a big project that is before us. And I think, I thank you for the question, because I'll keep thinking about that and working with my institution to answer it from here.
Great. All right, thank you so much, Rhonda. This has been such a lovely opportunity to sit and think with you and reflect with you. So thank you. As we conclude our program today, I would just like to extend a great deal of gratitude and thanks to Professor McGee, to Dean Rougeau, and to all of my colleagues in the Center for Teaching Excellence for making today possible. I am incredibly lucky to get to work with such a talented group of professionals. For those of you who are interested in continuing today's conversation, we are organizing a virtual reading group this summer of Professor McGee's recent book. You can find more information about that reading group on the CTE website, and we'll also be sending some emails about it. I'd also mention that the CTE, in collaboration with CEDL, the library, and others, are also getting ready to launch a series of resources and programs this summer meant to help instructors prepare for the new pedagogical challenges fall semester is likely to bring. We're already hearing from instructors who are eager to get started with fall course planning, and we want to make sure you have the support you need. So please keep an eye out for announcements about those programs as well. Finally, just wanted to note that we'll be sending you a link to a brief survey about today's program. Your feedback is always so helpful to us, not only in thinking about how to continue today's discussion, but also just thinking about how we can best serve your needs more generally during this time. So thank you to everyone for taking the time to share your feedback with us. Thank you for making time to join us today. We wish you and yours health and peace in the months ahead. Thank you so much.